Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Diane Lipscomb, and I'm the director of the Carney Institute for Brain Science, and we are hosting. We've been, myself and Chris Moore, who's the associate director of the Institute. We're both professors in neuroscience, so thanks for joining us. Today, we're really excited to be talking with 3 undergraduates from Brown University who have interest in brain science, and they're all involved in research. So we know it's going to be a really incredibly exciting discussion. And what I actually often like to say is that I think, if you're interested in knowing what the future of brain science is going to look like, talk to a Brown undergraduate. They're the weather vanes of pointing to the future. They're free from a lot of the assumptions that we have when we're doing our research, and I just think it's always incredibly exciting. And so we're really very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say about how they got into neuroscience, brain science, how they got into a lab, and what they're looking forward to just in terms of the future. So I'm just going to go through and introduce who we'll be talking to just very, very quickly, because they're going to do most of the talking. But we've got Flavia Maria Galeazzi, who's class of 26. She's a second year at Brown, double concentrator in biological physics, biophysics, and computer science. Flavia joined Professor Ahmed Abdel Fattah's lab last year, I think, and was supported by an undergraduate research teaching assistantship over the summer. Flavia is going to tell us a lot more about her research, as I said, but she's kind of really, as you'll hear from most of the students here, combining a number of different disciplines: chemistry, biophysics, computer science, and neuroscience, toward, in her case, was developing better and brighter voltage sensors to monitor neuronal activity. Liana Lewis is future class of 2025, a junior, double concentrator in neuroscience and philosophy. And Liana is working in Kate O'Connor-Giles's lab, who's in the Department of Neuroscience also. And Liana's also doing this really interesting combination of kind of different disciplines: neuroscience, genetics, probably some computational work, and studying the synaptic connections between neurons and the way in which different molecules kind of modulate the neuronal connectivity. She's working on a set of proteins that are my favorite. I'm sure she'll talk about those later, more about that soon. And then finally, Nikolai Rogalinski, who's a senior, future class of 2024. And Nikolai's concentrating in neuroscience, and he's doing research across 2 different labs, one Professor Wilson Tricolo and the other Professor Stephanie Jones. And both of these labs are pretty heavy computational labs, but they're both really interested in taking recordings, content-rich recordings of neuronal signals from the human brain, in both like healthy conditions and also thinking about kind of disease, and then extracting information to learn more about kind of the mechanistic underpinnings of disease. So again, really looking forward to hearing from you, Nikolai. I'm just going to do a couple of little comments about the way that we're going to run. So we're going to be talking, Chris and I, but at any time during our discussions, please go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom page and just post some questions, things that you're thinking about. And then, Chris and I could just talk for hours, I know, but we won't. We'll be finishing up on the hour. But if you have any questions, then we'll start to look through those as the students are talking, and then pose those questions to people as we go through. So just go ahead and post questions if you have something on your mind. So I think, Chris, we'll probably just kick off, right? Anything you want to add?
No, just really grateful to all of you for coming to talk to us.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think one of the, a way to start is to just ask each of you in turn, probably start with Flavia. How did you get into neuroscience? brain science. Tell us a bit about your journey coming to Brown, how you made this selection. We'll talk a bit more about the logistics of getting in the lab, but just an intro to you, Flavia, and your interests and what got you here.
Yeah, I'm an international student. I'm from Italy, and I've always been passionate about STEM subjects, and since I was really young. And in fact, when it was time to choose a high school in Italy, we have like different types of high schools. I chose like the scientific high school where there was a focus more on like STEM subjects. And I've always been interested in how like all these STEM subjects overlap. And during high school, I participated in chemistry Olympiad and other like science competitions. And that was like a very important part of my high school experience. And that was like a way of, it really helped me develop an interest in these subjects. And then during COVID, I decided to take like Introduction to Neuroscience as a summer class at Harvard. And through that class, I was really able to have to develop my interest for neuroscience. And in fact, for example, like I remember that there was a lab in that class where we were supposed to dissect like a sheep brain. But since it was online, obviously we could only like do it virtually. But I was like so interested in it that I just went to the supermarket and I like bought a sheep brain and then like dissected it at home. And yeah, from that class on, I was always after taking that class, I was always like passionate about neuroscience and in general exploring how we can apply different methods of also different disciplines to neuroscience and developing tools for neuroscience.
Awesome. That is the first time I've heard of someone going out to acquire their own sheep brain, and it's just amazing.
Thanks, Flavia. Same.
Yeah.
I mean, we in the lab that I started my postdoc in, that they actually use cow bovine material, and so their day started in the slaughterhouses, in the meat factories, actually taking samples of the animals. And I did not do that, but I actually got up much later than my colleagues who had to go do that. Yeah, shows passion. So let me just move on. Liana, same question for you.
Yeah, I think my passion for neuroscience and kind of started young. My mom's a neuroethicist, actually. So I think she really enjoyed using like me and my friends when we were little kids as like focus groups. Like it was like, we want to go over to the weird girls like house for dinner, because her mom is like, what happens? Do you die when you sleep? Like, what happens to your brain? So like definitely started asking those questions really young. And I was like, interesting questions. And I was so fascinated by them from a young age, and kind of started realizing that those questions were actually something I could study, and took philosophy on quite young, and then had a real passion for biology and was really excited to get to Brown and be able to specialize into neuroscience. And then arrived and took Neuro 10, and it was the best class I'd ever taken. It was just a room full of people who were really passionate about brains, and also like so excited to talk about them as well. Like it was a massive class, but it was not one of those seminars where you get lost. Like I was a freshman, I was first semester. Professors were so passionate, and like I remember one of the professors was like, I brought a brain for us to look at, and just like lifted up a plastic bag and took a formaldehyde brain out. And I was like, this is the best class ever. And then they offered us t-shirts for class participation, and they just kept getting better. And I think it really solidified my love for neuroscience, and just kind of kept going from there, kept getting involved, taking more classes, and it was off to the races.
Thank you. So we've got two hooks, like a couple of things hooked both of you. Brains being the theme, like not surprisingly. So Nikolai, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say my story in comparison feels almost a little more mundane. When I was in middle school, we got this chance in our science class to do like an open-ended final project. And I don't even remember how I chose the brain for this project, but I did. And from there, I started looking at things at a very basic level. I was in 7th grade, and just as I kept looking and looking and looking, and it got more and more and more interesting. And I decided, I really want to go after this. I want to pursue this. And then I got into high school, and I started realizing how much I enjoyed math. And then I thought, oh, man, I've got to either pick or do twice the work. And then someone introduced me to the idea of computational neuroscience, and I learned that someone had already combined them, so I didn't have to do the work of combining them. That was already a whole subfield. And then that's how I chose to apply to the colleges that I did, was based on the best neuroscience programs. And I'm happy to say I ended up with the best one.
We will not disagree. Brilliant. Chris?
Yeah, we can have lots of reinforcing comments like that throughout the thing. It is really amazing too, in all of your stories, it really came out in yours, Nikolai, how much, just certain events that feel very idiosyncratic, or they're, maybe in Liana, like you weren't noticing, these were just the questions at the kitchen table, or when you were being ethically used as focus groups. But it totally sets up a path, right? It certainly speaks to the importance of getting involved with kids and with people in the community if we're interested in recruiting brilliant next gen neuroscientists too. So that's quite cool. So we already have one of the questions in the Q&A that is one of the ones that we were most interested in asking you also. So maybe we'll go in the same order and ask, what was the process by which you landed in the lab that you're in? How did that, like in the material sense, like how did that proceed as a I don't know, a way that you found your way to that learning and discovery location? So maybe Flavia, we'll go in the same order, just keep things balanced, keep people talking at this, some sort of constant phase shift. So Flavia, maybe you could tell us how you found your way to Ahmed's lab.
For me, it all started in my freshman year, so last year, around October, I looked at Today at Brown one day. It's like an email that we all get every day at Brown, that kind of is a summary of everything that is happening at Brown. And that day, Professor Ahmed Abdel Fattah was giving a talk at the chemistry symposium. And I just saw the title and I thought it was cool and interesting. And, I was just a freshman, so I was like trying to explore and get involved with the events at Brown. And I was thinking like, why not? Let's check this out. Then I went to the chemistry symposium, and I remember that I was like looking inside the door, and I saw that there were all professors inside and no students, and I was a bit intimidated, like, should I go in, should I not? Then I made the right decision and I walked inside, and it was an amazing talk. And later I thought that I was interested in working in Ahmed's lab, and so I tried to email him, and then I talked to him, and then I got this opportunity, and then I started working in his lab. Yes, and that's also shows how like going to events at Brown is like I highly recommend checking out all of these events. And like in general, like colloquiums, they happen in almost every discipline that you're interested in, and especially like a tip for undergraduates to get involved in the lab would surely be to like explore these events and hear different talks from different researchers. And it's truly like amazing opportunity as an undergraduate to hear about all of the work that people are doing at Brown.
Yeah, it's super great that you didn't stop. You kept going into, because that's very easy to have happen at a place that's got everything from postdoc education all the way down to, in the summer we have the high schools. Like, it's very easy to accidentally get in a room that might not, quote unquote, be the level you're at, but so what? The fact that you just went in and you got what you got from it, but you were able to realize that Ahmed's brilliant, which is something we've all had that experience of going to one of Ahmed's talks, Dr. Abdel Fattah's talks, and leaving super impressed. So that's great. I think you're right. Kind of getting your nose in a very specific way. I think it's a lot easier to find your way into labs if you have a actual specific interest, not just I generally should do this at some point kind of interest. That might be, not to overly prescribe it, but that might be part of it. Great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Mhm.
It's also, I was just going to say, it's interesting, and maybe, we'll see, but I thought it was interesting that you mentioned kind of two things that happen fairly close in time. Like you saw, the news at Brown about research, and then you saw, Ahmed Abdel Fattah, and so something like those two things happening kind of closely in time. Maybe that just kind of hit something above the noise, like the general noise, and suddenly that was the motivation. I mean, obviously you're thinking about it, but there's this thing, obviously we think a lot in neuroscience about coincidence of signals occurring temporarily matched, and it felt a little, as you were talking about that kind of what happened on that day. And that was probably some of the encouragement that you had. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this. Great.
Yeah, thanks. So Liana, how did you find your way to your lab?
Yeah, I'm in the Kate O'Connor-Giles lab, and mine was kind of serendipity. I had met with Professor Connors because I had wanted to talk to someone just about the process of getting into a lab, and he was actually super helpful and gave me this list of like kind of how to get in, how, like, what he thought, labs that he thought were great for undergrads to be in. And I kind of came out of that meeting, and then a couple of days later I was having lunch with a friend, and she was like, oh, did you see this Workday posting? There's like a lab that's looking for undergrads to apply. And I was like, oh no, I didn't see it. And I looked at the name, and it happened to be like the first name that had been on Professor Connors' list as labs that he thought were great for undergrads. And I was like, great. And I had like 4 hours remaining to apply, and I did. And they happened to ask me for an interview, and that was like the day that I now met my mentor, who I now work with like every day. And it was like this great interview, and I remember just feeling like I clicked with all the people in the lab and being like, oh my god, these people are so great. I really, really hope that I get this job. And then they offered me a place in the lab, and it was kind of this serendipitous, amazing moment.
That's awesome. And it also does seem like another constant. Maybe this fits with synchrony coding that Diane was mentioning, is if in general that it's something you want to do and you're kind of ready, then when the accident of the opportunity, not the accident, but the spontaneous opportunity shows up, it's easier to just act quickly.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I also think, like, in a more general sense, if I'm giving advice to someone, just like being proactive, cold emailing. I know so many people who have gotten into labs just by reaching out to people. It feels terrifying. I was a sophomore, emailing professors being like, hey, please meet with me, feels really scary. But actually people are so receptive. Like, that's what that process taught me. Like, they want to hear from you.
That's awesome. That's great too, that you got good responses that way.
Liana,
I was
just going to wonder, like, could you tell us just quickly a bit more about the interview? Because that might be something quite different.
Yeah. I sat down with, I think 3 members of the lab, and they had like questions in front of them, and they gave me a sheet of questions so that I knew what questions they were going to ask, actually. They gave me the sheet in the interview, and we just kind of worked through them. And I thought it was going to be a really formal process, but it was actually like very informal. I walked in, and like, I think a second later we were talking about England and Harry Potter, which was a really nice icebreaker. And then we just like talked through the interview. And I remember I've talked to Amanda, who was in my interview and now I know well because works in my lab, and she was like, we could just tell you were so passionate. Like, I think that's what they were looking for. Like, you know, I didn't have a strong background in the neuroscience that the lab was doing specifically because it's a learning curve. And like what they were looking for were people who wanted to learn and like wanted to be there and were passionate about the subject.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, that is a very easy thing to forget. It happens a lot in graduate school too, where people kind of forget that it's school is in the name, right? It's almost like you have to so much bring something to find a way in, whereas hopefully it's more like the experience that you're both, I think, describing of an opportunity, and then you can be mentored after that. So Nikolai, you are working in 2 labs, which is really cool. Maybe give us two tales of finding your way to those labs.
Yes, indeed. I do have 2 separate stories, but actually, interestingly enough, I've got sort of a story that combines each from Flavia and Liana. My first lab that I joined was Professor Wilson Trucolo's, and he was a cold email case. So when my freshman year was all COVID, so there's no real research opportunities that were offered, and I didn't get into it in any way. I didn't know how to start the process. I was more focused on just adapting to college and whatever COVID was at the time. And then my sophomore fall, I started feeling like, okay, well, I have this general idea of where I want to go next, and what I want to do next involves doing some research in undergrad. And so I found a very helpful website, Researchers at Brown. If there's any Brown undergraduates who are watching this who need to find something, Researchers at Brown is a great website. And it just has all of them. So, you select a department. I put in the keywords computational neuroscience, and then I just sat at my computer for hours looking at lab websites, reading the different labs' missions and their publications, not full publications, but, to get an idea of what they're doing. And then I sent out some cold emails, and Professor Trucolo responded, and I met with him to sort of tell him a little bit more about myself. And next thing you know, I started going to lab meetings and then presenting and then having my own project, and all sort of snowballed from there. And then the second lab that I'm in, the Jones lab, with Professor Stephanie Jones, I got into after taking her class. She teaches a class and co-teaches it with Professor Moore here, actually. And so I took that class, and just throughout the class, talked to her, got to know her more, her research more. And by the end of the semester, I was talking with her over my final project, and I sort of asked in a half joking way, do you have any openings in your lab? Because I could always do more research. And she said, why don't you write up an email for me, and I will send it along to my lab and see if there's anybody in the lab who's looking for someone, an undergraduate, to help on a project. And that's how I got into that one. That's my serendipity moment.
Those are both really cool. One thing I'd want to highlight as both having been on the sending and receiving end, just because we're old doesn't mean we didn't go through this at some point in our own time. Even though it's a cold call, you really have a lot you can learn beforehand. And a completely cold call that's just, hey, I'm looking for a lab, you got your room? It has none of the resonance that even a single sentence or a single question that shows a person took the time to know a little bit about what the lab's about. In other words, they pre-screened that this is truly something they're interested in, not just, I feel like I should get this experience at this point in my education, but whatever that might be. And it need not, just again, now speaking from the old fogey on the other side of the email, it need not be a question. It just has to show interest and that you thought about it and that you actually had contact with it. It need not be sophisticated or something like that. It's not like a really intricate query or something. Just showing that you took the time to really know what the lab was at least recently doing before their last paper. That means a lot in receiving such an email. That's really cool. I also have to say, but maybe this fits in the category of what you were saying before, Nikolai, about how great it is to be here at Brown. Working with 2 computational neuroscientists, we just have such a wonderful group of people doing work in that area. It's I mean, it's personally, all of it's exciting for me, and that's one of the most exciting things. Is it's almost an embarrassment of riches right now, and how many. It's so good that you're you're taking big bites out of multiple experiences there.
Yeah. So, we should find out about what you're doing in the lab, about the research. And, I think it's worth describing it, but certainly the type of research you're doing, but also, a little bit about what it means just in terms of the difference of learning about something and then actually doing something. Like, does it matter? Like, is it a different experience? Well, we do bench research, so like a little bit, but like you're in it now and you're not so far into it. But like, maybe you can describe some of that as well, describing a bit about your project without like reaching out. Not everybody is going to be a neuroscientist probably who's listening, but Flavia, tell us a bit about your project, and then perhaps a bit more about the meaning of doing the research to you and how it felt. So like, what does it feel like?
Sure. So an important challenge in neuroscience is to monitor neuron activity in a live animal. And as you might know, brain cells communicate via electric signals and are associated with a change in membrane voltage. And in the lab, the goal is to translate membrane voltage in brain cells to a light output. And we're developing a membrane protein, so a protein that sits on a membrane of a cell, that can change its fluorescence properties when the membrane voltage changes. And specifically this summer, I was working on designing these like membrane proteins that can be imaged using red light. And we're interested in using red light. One of the reasons for this is that we can image deeper in the tissue, which is very important, especially when we're working with a live brain. Also, many proteins designed in the field they show like a negative going response, so they become dimmer when the cell fires an action potential. Whereas this summer, I worked on designing a positive going variant, meaning that the cell would light up when it fires an action potential instead of becoming dimmer. And this is important, and you can think about this as like, as you're able, it's much easier to see a light, something light up in a dark room than let's say something getting darker in a room full of light. And this concept is called shot noise. And this analogy in general like works well when working in a live brain where you have many cells that are like expressing your protein. And so the whole brain lights up and it's just easier to see a positive going signal compared to a negative going. Recently, like this summer, I generated a lot of data. And also like the main advantage of using voltage imaging is to monitor different states of the neuron. And in order to do this, we have to take many pictures of the cells in a short amount of time, which means that we're generating a lot of data. And so this semester, I'm working on designing a data analysis pipeline specific for our research for voltage imaging data. And in order to do this, I use Napari, which is a multidimensional image visualization tool coded in Python developed by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And I am developing a plugin to enable cell segmentation, so like extracting the cells from the image and then analyzing the fluorescence readout in response to voltage change. And we envision in general, like in the future, the field of voltage imaging getting bigger, and so this data analysis pipeline can only like be used by us in the lab, but also by the users of our membrane proteins. And yeah, already like the Fleshman lab, like some people in the Fleshman lab are starting to use our voltage imaging data analysis pipeline. Yeah, in response to the second question, I would say it's certainly different to learn things versus when you're starting to do them in the lab. for me, during the first few months, I was mainly like reading literature and reading papers and helping people in the lab. And I kind of learned different skills, also like from a wet lab perspective, by helping out different people. But then it's definitely a different thing when you have your own project and you need to suddenly apply all of the skills that you learned to your own project. And it's also like having your own project also involves like presenting your work and having like more responsibility over what you're doing. And that's something that I believe is very different. And also another reason I believe to join like a research lab is that personally, like I've been for me, I learned a lot in the wet lab, but also I learned how to present my work. At the end of the summer, I presented a poster, and also I like made some group meeting presentations, which really helped my like public speaking skills and in general how to design and present research. I feel it's a really important aspect that also helped me not just in my research, but also as for my personal development.
That's awesome. I can vouch, not to keep saying how old I am, but I literally remember the first year that I was in graduate school. There were some attempts to be able to actually visualize how the electrical activity in the brain fluctuates with light signals. And I remember thinking, this is literally the greatest thing in the world. And the methods were always just kind of there. They weren't actually working fully. And what you're getting to work on and what, of course, the Abdel Fattah Lab is pushing forward and Ahmed's pushing forward is just, potentially just really revolutionary and exciting in what it's able to bring to us as end users, right? As people that are applying it. So it's neat to see. It's a really exciting project to get to work on.
Thanks, Flavia, Chris, Liana.
Yeah, I'll go next. So the Kate O'Connor-Giles lab is a neuroscience and genetics lab, and we study synapses, which are kind of how the neurons talk to each other, the gaps between neurons. And we kind of study how those synapses are organized to create different release probabilities. So when certain connections between neurons are used a lot, those synapses become potentiated. They're used more, so they become more likely to fire. And so we kind of study what makes those changes happen. How do those changes happen? So specifically, I work on calcium channels a lot. Calcium channels are really necessary for synapses. They're what let the kind of ions go into the synapses, which is what causes them to fire, which is what allows them to communicate with the neuron that they're trying to communicate with. And I specifically am working on a subunit of calcium channels called the alpha-2 delta subunit. So calcium channels have kind of a main pore-forming section, which is what ions travel into the cell through. And then there's an additional kind of protein attached. And we're looking at kind of that protein and how it modulates the function of calcium channels and synapses as a whole, as a result. And I'm looking at how that subunit kind of interacts with different proteins already within the synapses and how it affects synapse organization and things like that. And to answer the second part of the question, kind of what does it mean to be involved in the science versus learning it? I just remember being so excited when I first got into the lab. Like, there's such a difference between like sitting in a classroom and learning the science and like feeling like you're part of the field. Like, it's so exciting. I kind of remember having the feeling of like, who is letting me do this? My first couple of weeks in lab, like who's let me be in here? Who's let me, as a 20-year-old, like be part of this field and like be part of the people who are kind of making progress. And it's so exciting. And you read these papers and then suddenly you're contributing to papers and they're going out and other people are reading them, and it's an amazing feeling.
I think that's really interesting that you mentioned that, Liana, because it's almost, I mean, of course that's what happens here, and I think it's I feel we'll have to hear from Nikolai, I'm sure. but I think like there isn't really much of a hierarchy in the labs, and I think that you come in as, you know, researchers and people really interested in the project and become really enmeshed in the project, which I think is what you want in that kind of experience. But you're almost saying it's almost like this privilege because you're benefiting from all of this other stuff that's gone on, and suddenly like you're there and you've got this built on all of this knowledge, and you're gaining from it all the time. It's like, I mean, it's just such a really interesting observation you made. I think really is very meaningful, right? In a crazy way as well.
Yeah, I think it's something really special about Brown as well, is that there are these labs where they let you in, like completely, you come in as a researcher, like you hit the ground running, like you're contributing to projects, you're helping with papers, you know, like there's no kind of like, oh, you're an undergrad, like kind of do the grunt work, get coffee. There's none of that. It's like day one, here's some flies. I work in a Drosophila fly lab. Like let's start doing some science, you know, which is amazing. And it definitely contributes to that feeling of like this is such a privilege to be part of the science.
Thanks. Great. Nikolai.
Yeah, so I actually have a little bit of a different experience in the sense that since both of my labs do what we call translational work, so we do science that then gets applied medically. I actually have a bit of a different experience because I'm not qualified to do really any of the data collection. So for example, in Dr. Truglow's lab, I'm working with this epilepsy data set that was collected at Mass General up in Boston by this other lab that he's collaborating with at Harvard. And so, you know, I'm not part of that lab, but I then take all their data, not all their data, but I take the subset of data that applies to my project, and then I run it through all of these lines of code, and then I get output, and then, you know, I figure out how that fits into my project. So it's very interesting being in that position, because as I'm looking through all of this output on my end, and it feels like, oh, you know, this is enough for my own project, I also remember that there's this whole other person's project that actually got me that data in the first place. And so again, to expand a little more on that, it's an epilepsy data set that's collected, and they record patients who are about to undergo surgery, so they can actually implant electrodes, which you can't do if you're not about to undergo surgery because it's too invasive. So they implant electrodes, and then what they do is they stimulate at one electrode, and then they record at another, and then they stimulate at one and they record at another. And they do this to get information, trying to get information about how a seizure spreads, which is the primary thing that happens with epilepsy, is you get seizures. And so if we can figure out how these seizures spread, where they start, what they look like in the brain, then hopefully we can treat them a little better. And so that's where my project comes in, is really looking at those waveforms and seeing what looks like a seizure and how it's different when you're actually awake and when you're asleep, because you can get seizures when you're asleep too. And then the project for the Jones Lab is actually, again, it's similar. I took a data set that's publicly available. It's called the Human Connectome Project. And it's this big project that looks to, you know, map out the human brain, how it's connected, and how that structure relates to its function. And that was done by a bunch of different researchers at a bunch of colleges or universities, all came together. And then there's this open access data set that the Jones Lab has had for a little bit, and just, you know, hasn't really gotten through yet. And so I sort of came in, and that was what the postdoc, who is my mentor, was tackling. And so that's what I got put onto as well, was taking this data set and basically making it usable data for everyone else in the lab. So when you're from an outside perspective, it sort of feels like data is data, right? You know, you record something and then you pass on that recording, or you take an image of the brain and then you pass on that image to someone, right? Well, there's a whole lot of different file types, and then someone might code something a certain way that doesn't work on your system because you've got all sorts of things set up differently, and there's just a million things that can be ever so slightly different. And as computers do, they run things exactly as you tell them to. So if it's slightly off, then it doesn't work for you. So my project there is taking this big data set, and then again, like I said, it's basically transforming all of this data into something that works with the software that our lab uses, and coding pipelines that other people in our lab use so that it can be used more easily by them. And then how it feels, I mean, I think I sort of spoke to that a little bit in my my preamble there, is a little different. It's still very rewarding, and I love what I do, but it's definitely different being in a computational lab where a lot of times you're not necessarily doing the data collection. I mean, that's certainly not always true. I had another summer research experience at another university where I did both. I did wet lab research and then ran the coding on that. So there's still very much an opportunity for you. If you want to join the right lab, then you'll do both sides of things, or you might end up on one side or the other, collecting data and sending it off to someone else to analyze, or doing that analysis yourself. So I think that also sort of speaks to the plethora of opportunities that are out there. And, you know, whatever you're interested in, there's going to be someone out there who does it and can help teach you more about it.
Yeah, this is just great what you're all conveying. And Nikolai, that was really cool to hear the perspectives you're bringing on it. Something, just to zoom out, that's coming out of, I think, all of the comments you're making is just just use the sports analogy, but it's just such a team sport. Like, and you know, there's this, I don't know, like really crappy Marvel Universe view of scientists as living alone in some tower somewhere and concocting these. It's the opposite. It's a you don't have to be a hypersocial personality, but it's an intensively interpersonally networked thing if you're going to do it and really do interesting work. And so, you know, hearing, you know, that two of these projects, you know, Nikolai and Flavia, both of you are literally trying to help decode data so that others can more effectively use it to even pass the ball further, right? It's not just that you're receiving data from somewhere else. And obviously, Liana had the great experience of now really being on a team, like literally, like not just, I don't know, carrying the water bottle or serving the coffee, what was it you said, but really being on it. That jibes really well with, I don't know, the experience throughout is, and the more that can go smoothly, and there's lots of things that aren't just textbooks and aren't just computers and make that work well, like helping people get along together and collaborate, or at least have the opportunity to talk and jog people into thoughts they wouldn't have had otherwise. That's kind of the secret sauce of trying to have a really good environment for discovery and for education in general, I think. Not to go on and on about this, but it really pops out of what you're all saying. I don't think you're trying to say team sport per se, but it's just so resonant in what you were communicating.
Yeah, and if I could add on just real quick there,
please.
I sort of have this recollection of when I was younger and thinking about what I wanted to do, and getting into research and all that. I sort of had this idea that like, oh, I can do this one project, you know, that will go so far or do whatever, you know, I'm going to be the one that does it. I'm going to be the face of it. And then as you get more into real science, and not like the old stuff where, yeah, you know, there was one researcher in the 1850s who was working on this one really specific thing. So yes, they were the only one who did that thing, and they get their name on it. As you get into the modern world, there are so many people doing so much research, and you're always going to be on a team, and that's not a bad thing. You know, at some point you're going to need to know something that you don't know, and so you need other people, and it's also really fun to pass on what you know to someone else, to have them either be inspired or help you or whatever. So, you know, if you're out there and you have this notion that like you're going to do it all alone, it might not happen, and that's not a bad thing at all.
Yeah, I would also add that like I think neuroscience is like also so like specifically in the field of neuroscience, there are so many levels at which this research is happening. As someone who studies a tiny subunit on a calcium channel in a synapse that is in a neuron, that's in a like kind of massive system, which is in a brain, which is in a body, like there are so many levels that this research is happening on. And like none of them are mutually exclusive. All of them require each other. And like, it's incredible to see the research that people are doing at like macroscopic levels compared to what I'm doing, and also see how their research actually needs my research and my research needs their research. So like as a field, it is necessarily a team sport as well.
Yeah, I would also
Go ahead, Flavia. Yeah.
I would also add that in general, the field of neuroscience and biological sciences field is also increasing like interdisciplinary, and it's a field that is really welcoming like people from different backgrounds. For example, like even in the field of protein engineering, there are many people that come, let's say, with a chemistry background or like physics background or let's say computer science background, and I'm also kind of an example of this. It's really interesting. It's increasingly interesting to develop tools and apply like these computational models, or like let's say this comes in many different flavors, like applying computational models, or even like doing protein engineering, like applying all these like methods from other fields to neuroscience to solve problems in neuroscience. And in general in the biological sciences, I feel like that's something that is really interesting to me, and that I feel happening more and more in the future too.
Thank you. So Chris, were you gonna?
Yeah, I mean, we have so many questions.
I know.
We're only like 10 minutes away from being done, so we have
I know,
to
I'm
make
looking
sure.
at the time.
This is that's such a cool feeling too, that suddenly the hour is evaporating, which means the conversation's fascinating. I think there's kind of two directions that obviously we could spend remaining. There's a few thousand directions that we could take advantage of having you on the screen. I think there's two that are really interesting. Maybe we could throw these both out, and whatever you'd like to throw in, and we could just round robin it or just chime in. One is, there's a couple of revolutions happening, a couple thousand, but again, really big revolutions, especially in the openness of science. This comes out both in the attitudes that we're talking about and in the availability of data sets, they're not cloistered anymore behind, if you read the paper and you wrote the person, you drove and got the hard drive, maybe you could get the data, but rather it's a requirement in many places that they're made available. And that's a whole new form of communication. It's like literally just communicating the data straight into the world of possible users. But there's a lot of other things going on, formerly known as Twitter, as one example, but so many ways that people are communicating science now. Thoughts? I guess it's not a well-posed question, because I'm more interested in kind of priming the topic and seeing where you'd like to go with it. It just feels like there's such opportunity. It's such an exciting time in that way in science. And I'm sure you understand this much, much better than I personally do in terms of the opportunities there. I don't know, did anyone want to, any particular thoughts about maybe what's the future of that kind of communication, or ways in which it can change or it should change?
I'll chime in. I think, as you said, it's just such an exciting time to be in the field. Like, I'm so excited by all of the changes that have that I'm witnessing. There are two main things that I can think about. One is kind of bioarchives, which is kind of this place that papers are now put up before they are formally reviewed, and it means that people can have access to the data and the things that you're doing before you're actually like ready to publish, because publishing is a many year process, or can be a many year process. And it was something that I got contact with quickly when I entered my lab, because my mentor was working on a paper that she was putting up on bioarchive. And it's kind of this amazing process, because it means that like science is just so much more open. Like, people are so much more aware of what is happening around them. There's no kind of like lag time in the science that is being actively discussed, which I think is really exciting. And also, like, bioarchives, any country, anywhere you are, you can access this data, this information. Like, these channels are just so much more open. As an international student, that's really exciting to me, because, eventually I plan to go back to England, but the idea that like that's not going to be a barrier for me working on maybe the things that I'm working on now, and continue doing that, which is really exciting. And then the other thing that I was going to mention, which is as a philosopher, it's also really exciting because this is also a time when, you know, we're getting other disciplines involved in neuroscience, and, you know, just seeing the ways that these subjects interact. I will plug Professor Moore's class, which is the mechanisms and meanings of neurodynamics, which I'm taking right now. And we talk about consciousness and the kind of neuroscience underpinnings of consciousness. And just before, I have a class in the philosophy department called Consciousness, where we discuss like what it means to be conscious. Like, do you have an internal voice that is speaking to you? Like, how are we conscious? How are our mind and brain and soul connected? And it is a crazy experience to go between those two classes, and amazing as well, because it's literally two fields coming at the same problem from different directions. And it makes me realize every time that, like, really, if we combine these fields and we work from different directions at the same problem but we're working together, we're much more likely to get at the problem, which I think is amazing and also a really exciting thing in the field.
Thanks. I mean, that's so Flavia, go ahead and then we'll.
Okay. Something I can think of is also how like science is getting increasingly open and increasingly like digital in a way, meaning that also the science communication is changing. And for as an example, we're able like to communicate via Zoom and really like connect to anybody else in the world, and presumably have a research project or collaborate with anybody in the world. And I feel like this really enables like the exchange of ideas. And also we can even like, let's say, join a conference via Zoom, for example, or even let's say I use Slack commonly, which is like an app that allows you to enter a community and message with different people. And there are many like Slack communities that focus on different interests. As an example, I'm in the machine learning for protein engineering community, or there are all sorts of other ones that really help like connect people with similar interests, similar like academic interests, and share papers and opportunities with each other.
Thanks, Flavia. That's great. Nikolai, do you want to add anything? I'm going to kind of kick off with the last question, but no pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess real quick, you know, to echo what they both said, it's definitely becoming a much more open field, which is obviously a great thing in so many ways. I'm doing an honors thesis, which involves a very long writing component. And the first part of that is doing a big literature review. And just that's an experience. I've never written anything like it before. Going through and finding all these sources and realizing how many things I'm able to access. And also remembering that those all used to be at some point some thick printed journal that was in someone's library somewhere is absolutely crazy, because, you know, I'm looking at one paper and it's volume 107 and issue whatever. So it's crazy to think about what digitization has done for that. And it's really enabled someone like me to, at my level, be able to write something like this. And I can do it from my desk at home, or I can do it at the lab. I have to be at Brown's library. I don't have to go to another state to look at their college's library, because, you know, our library doesn't happen to have some book that I need to cite. And so, I mean, it's really great in that sense.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, you know, picture came into my head when I was writing my thesis. You know, I was in the stacks in the basement of a library in the dark, like searching through volumes, and you go from one volume and then you like write down a piece of paper. It's like, oh, now I have to go look the reference list. You have to go to the reference list and go look it up, and then go find the next volume of this other journal and go read it again. And so it's like, you know, then you end up with like pile of journals you have to, I mean, it's just like a completely different experience. But the inaccessibility, like you have to be in the right place. You have to be in an incredibly well-resourced library. And that was not everywhere then. I mean, still not, but the accessibility is phenomenal. And then the accessibility to understanding particular area is also really extraordinary, because like you'd have to go look up a word or get a definition of a particular acronym or something, and even so you know, the feasibility of like, do you have a library, can you go into the stacks, can you get in, can you go do it, but then like when you start to read, like how do you understand this and how do you jump to a different discipline? And so like all of those steps are just, I mean, there was an advantage too. It's actually, I really quite liked going into the stacks and reading these things without any distraction. But like the accessibility is just extraordinary right now, just to emphasize what you just said.
We used to joke in grad school, photocopier burns, but it wasn't necessarily a joke, because
Right.
these stacks
Right.
that were enormous, and you bring them to the photocopier,
Right.
and you'd sit there for like,
Right.
you'd bring a friend. I used to bring friends and catch up with them, because you're just folding pages, because you wanted to scribble on it, and you wanted to have it because it was physical, and you had to, it's so liberating. There is the loss of the accidental find, which, Diane, I'm sure you know, like you're in the right section, you accidentally find something that's fabulous.
Yes.
That was a great feeling.
Yeah, no, you start reading the next page and the next page, and it wasn't in your plan, and you just like learn a lot of stuff. I mean, like we had to pay for our copy at each page of copying the book though as well. I don't know if you had to do that at MIT, but we had to do that in London.
Yes, we did.
It's like putting the coins in the copy machine. So it's fine. Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, and you know, what I promised everybody was to kind of dial forward, and this is your biggest challenge now, because you've each got a minute. And that wasn't intentional. I don't know how this happens, but it happens every time we do this, and especially today, which has just been really great. But look, where are the gaps? You know, just from your own perspective, you don't have to, you know, where do you see gaps? And you know, 10 years from now, you're going to be doing, Liana, you're going to be like studying voltage-gated calcium ion channels and fruit fly.
We'll see, honestly. I'm planning to go to med school, so that's somewhere in my future as well.
Right.
But I think like one of the things I want to see more in the future is just really cracking these disciplines open and just like breaking those walls down. You know, like why is neuroscience something radically different to philosophy? You know, why can't they just be all one big mush that we can play in? You know, getting clinically certified, and then breaking that all down, you know, research, clinical, philosophy, science, just all of it all together. That's my future hope.
Great. We like it. Yes to that. Nikolai.
Yeah, my next steps are hopefully MD, PhD. So a similar thing, going into even when I get more specialized, I'm still crossing all these disciplines, right? The medicine to the neuroscience, to the computer science and back again. I think that probably one of our biggest gaps is in the medical side of things. There's so many neurological diseases, and from my perspective, they're like the hardest to treat. We just have the fewest number of drugs that do something, because if you affect one part of the brain, you affect something totally different that you didn't mean to, and then now you don't have FDA approval. So I think that's like the biggest gap is neurological disease.
Great. And Flavia. Thank you, Nikolai.
For me, in the future, I would like to hopefully like go for a PhD, apply for PhD, and then in general, I would like to continue like exploring how we can apply like methods from like quantitative sciences, computational sciences, or like develop tools in general to solve biological problems, and specifically like neuroscience problems. That's something I'm broadly interested in. I think that one of the gaps that like there's certainly many questions that remain open in the field of neuroscience, and I believe that by developing these tools, we can solve them better, and we'll be enabled to see things that we just cannot see with our current tools and with our instruments that we have. And I believe it's really important to have like an interdisciplinary approach and invite people from different fields and different backgrounds to like neuroscience and collaborate to solve these big issues.
Great. Thank you all. I don't think that I should say anymore because you all said it. Yeah, I mean, it does resonate, Chris. Like Chris and I spend a lot of time in this discussion, you know, really thinking how to really promote that interdisciplinary kind of research, but not just for the sake of it, because like you can't understand and make advances in understanding the brain, neurological disorders, like how to measure in parallel all of the neural activity you need to be able to decode and read, you know, what it, you know, the action encoded, whatever it is, and it be complex behavior encoded in those neural signals, which we know is where the encoding occurs. And so, you know, you need to bring in just a whole variety of different expertise and disciplines in order to be able to advance. And yes, I mean, I think exactly where you started, Liana, like that at some level it is somewhat arbitrary, isn't it, and historical that these things emerge. But that I think is the great thing about neuroscience and brain science, which is we can't advance without all of those different disciplines and people coming in from other fields. And so perhaps the message is for people who are listening, who are interested in finding a lab or entering the field, you know, whatever you do, it's you're going to be contributing, and don't worry if you haven't taken a neuro class, because like you've done something and it's going to be incredibly valuable and invaluable. And yeah, welcome. And thank you for this really, really, really fabulous discussion. So we're going to say goodbye. We're a little over time, but that's warranted. Thank you, all three of you. It's really, really, really exciting. Liana, Flavia, and Nikolai. The future is secure.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
And
Sure.
thanks everyone for participating, joining us live for this discussion. Take care.